How to respond to someone who constantly irritates you because they lack self-awareness. The colleague everyone talks about but nobody corrects. The meeting had ended 15 minutes earlier, yet a few colleagues remained behind, packing laptops and finishing their coffee. The official discussion was over, but another conversation had quietly begun. The subject was familiar. Did you hear him explaining that process again? He doesn't actually understand how it works. He always sounds so confident. Nobody wants to argue with him anymore. Nobody sounded angry. They sounded tired. Everyone knew who was being discussed and why. What made the situation interesting was that none of these comments were ever said to him. Nobody confronted him or explained how he came across. In fact, if you had only attended the meeting, you might have assumed he was one of the most respected people in the room. People listened, nodded, and rarely challenged him. Then something happened that explained the frustration. As you packed your things, he commented on a decision you had already made. Earlier, you had silenced your phone to avoid distracting others. "You don't need to do that," he said. "Nobody cares about notification sounds." The comment was small, yet strangely irritating. Not because of the phone, because of the certainty. He wasn't asking why you had done it. He had already decided his view represented everyone else's. Most people have met someone like this. They explain things you already know, offer advice you never requested, and confidently speak on behalf of everyone. Individually, these moments seem harmless. Repeated often enough, they create friction. The irony is that people who behave this way are often the last to know it. Most colleagues stay polite. Most friends avoid the conversation. Instead, frustrations are saved for private discussions later. Which raises an interesting question. Why do some people seem completely unaware of how others experience them? And perhaps an even more uncomfortable one. If this colleague doesn't realize people discuss him after meetings, how can any of us be certain nobody talks about us the same way when we leave the room? The hidden phenomenon, the people who never receive accurate feedback. Most people assume self-awareness develops naturally with age and experience. The reality is more complicated. Self-awareness depends heavily on feedback. We learn how our behavior affects others through the reactions, comments, and observations of the people around us. The problem is that most adults receive far less honest feedback than they imagine. Think about the average workplace. People are expected to cooperate, maintain relationships, and avoid unnecessary conflict. Few employees enjoy difficult conversations, so diplomacy often wins over honesty. They say, "Looks good. Interesting idea. Let's think about that." No problem. Sometimes those responses are genuine. Sometimes they are simply the easiest way to avoid tension. What remains unsaid may be very different. "This isn't correct. That created extra work. I don't agree. I don't think this discussion is worth having." People often mistake the absence of criticism for approval. If nobody complains, they assume nobody minds. If nobody disagrees, they assume they must be right. But silence and approval are not the same thing. Many frustrating behaviors survive because people would rather tolerate them than discuss them. Correcting a colleague can be awkward, and challenging a confident person can be exhausting. The result is a distorted social mirror. When feedback is softened or absent, people can develop an inaccurate view of how others experience them. That is why some individuals seem genuinely surprised when criticism finally arrives. They are often working from incomplete information. This helps explain the colleague from the opening story. From his perspective, people listen, nod, and rarely disagree. The signals he receives suggest everything is fine. The irony is that the politeness designed to maintain harmony can sometimes prevent people from seeing themselves clearly. Which raises another question. If so many people receive incomplete feedback, how certain can any of us be that our own self-image is completely accurate? Evidence from everyday life. One reason this behavior is difficult to recognize is that it rarely appears dramatic. Most of the time, it shows up in small interactions that seem harmless on their own. The problem is that these moments accumulate. Consider someone watching videos on speakerphone in public. Nobody complains, so they assume nobody minds. Meanwhile, several people nearby are quietly irritated. The absence of objections gets mistaken for approval. The same pattern appears at work. Most people have encountered a colleague who confidently explains topics they only partly understand. Others nod politely and avoid correcting them. From the speaker's perspective, the lack of pushback feels like validation. A similar dynamic exists with people who constantly offer advice. Their intentions are often good, but because the advice is rarely requested, conversations start feeling more like lessons. The advice giver sees appreciation. The listener feels exhausted. These examples share a common feature. People are drawing conclusions from incomplete information. They assume what others do not say is just as important as what they do say. That assumption is often where the trouble begins. Why this happens inside the brain? To understand why this happens, it helps to think about the brain as less of a scientist and more of a lawyer. A scientist asks, "What's true?" A lawyer asks, "How can I defend my position?" Human beings like to imagine they are objective observers of reality, but most of us spend a surprising amount of time protecting our existing beliefs. When information supports our view of ourselves, we accept it easily. When information threatens that view, we become much more skeptical. Psychologists refer to this tendency as confirmation bias, but the basic idea is simple. We naturally notice evidence that supports what we already believe, and pay less attention to evidence that challenges it. Imagine someone believes they are knowledgeable and helpful. Every compliment becomes proof. Every person who listens becomes proof. Every time somebody follows their suggestion becomes proof. If a colleague quietly rolls their eyes, avoids future conversations, or complains later to somebody else, that information often never reaches them. Over time, a gap can emerge between how people see themselves and how others experience them. The larger that gap becomes, the more surprising criticism feels when it finally arrives. Why these people can be so irritating? Interestingly, the frustration people feel is rarely about intelligence. Many irritating colleagues are intelligent. Many have good intentions. The irritation usually comes from friction. There is something uniquely exhausting about being repeatedly advised by someone who appears not to understand the situation as well as they think they do. After a while, the issue stops being the content of their comments and becomes the pattern behind them. You begin feeling unseen. You find yourself thinking, if you understood the situation properly, you would understand why I made that decision. Yet the advice continues. The assumptions continue. The certainty continues. What makes the experience especially frustrating is that you often cannot respond honestly. Professional norms require diplomacy. Social relationships require tact. Instead of saying what you truly think, you smile, nod, and move on. Unfortunately, that politeness often reinforces the very behavior that caused the frustration in the first place. The mistake most people make. Eventually, even patient people reach a limit. After hearing the same comments repeatedly, the temptation is to finally say what has been building up for months. You think you know everything. Nobody agrees with you. That's a ridiculous suggestion. For a brief moment, those responses can feel satisfying. Then they usually make the situation worse. The reason is simple. People rarely become more self-aware when they feel attacked. Once criticism feels personal, most of the brain's energy shifts towards self-protection rather than self-reflection. The conversation stops being about understanding reality and becomes a battle to defend identity. The result is often exactly the opposite of what you hoped to achieve. What high performers do differently? People with strong professional reputations tend to understand an important distinction. They separate the other person's behavior from their own emotional reaction. Instead of trying to prove someone wrong, they focus on maintaining control of themselves. For example, when someone says, "That's ridiculous," a high performer is more likely to respond, "That's one way to look at it. I prefer being cautious." The goal is not to win the argument. The goal is to communicate your position without creating unnecessary conflict. Similarly, when someone dismisses your concern by saying, "Nobody cares about that," a more effective response might be, "Perhaps, I still prefer being considerate." Notice what happens. The conversation shifts away from judging people and toward discussing values and choices. When dealing with someone who constantly offers advice, a simple response such as, "I appreciate the suggestion, I've already decided how I want to handle it," is often more effective than a lengthy debate. These responses work because they establish boundaries without attacking character. They communicate confidence without hostility. Most importantly, They help guide the conversation toward finding solutions rather than escalating conflict. They allow you to remain professional, even when the other person is testing your patience. What effective professionals understand about difficult people. By the time most people search for an article like this, they are not dealing with a one-off irritation. They have usually spent weeks, months, or even years listening to the same comments, the same assumptions, and the same unsolicited advice. Eventually, they arrive at a tempting conclusion. If I could just explain this properly, they would finally understand. Sometimes that happens. The reason is that many frustrating conversations are not caused by a lack of information. They are caused by a difference in perspective. The other person is not necessarily missing facts. They may simply have little curiosity about viewpoints that differ from their own. This is why repeatedly trying to educate someone can become exhausting. Every new explanation feels like another attempt to push a locked door open. Effective professionals learn to recognize when understanding is unlikely to come from a longer explanation. Instead of trying to change the other person's worldview, they focus on communicating their own position clearly and calmly. Respond to the comment, not the history. One of the easiest mistakes to make is allowing 6 months of frustration to enter a conversation that only lasted 6 seconds. Imagine a colleague notices that you have silenced your phone before a meeting and says, "Nobody cares about notification sounds." What makes the comment irritating is not necessarily the sentence itself. It is the memory of dozens of similar moments that came before it. The challenge is to respond to the current comment rather than the accumulated frustration. A simple response such as, "Possibly. I still prefer keeping it silent during meetings," often works surprisingly well. You are not arguing. You are not seeking approval. You are simply explaining your choice. The conversation has nowhere productive to go after that. Calm certainty is more powerful than defensiveness. Many people assume confidence means speaking louder, arguing harder, or proving the other person wrong. In reality, calm certainty is often far more persuasive. Consider a colleague who tells you you're overthinking it. The instinctive response may be to defend yourself or explain why they're wrong. Yet a calm response such as, "Maybe, I'd rather spend a little extra thought on it than accidentally create a problem later," communicates confidence without creating conflict. Notice what happens. You are not surrendering your position. You are not attacking theirs. You are simply explaining the standard you choose to follow. That difference matters. Not every opinion requires a response. One of the most useful workplace skills is learning that disagreement does not automatically require engagement. Some comments are less like conversations and more like invitations to a debate that nobody truly needs. For example, people don't care about that. You could spend 10 minutes explaining why some people probably do care. Or you could simply say, "Perhaps, it's still the standard I prefer for myself." The second response accomplishes the same objective while using far less energy. Many workplace conflicts continue only because both people feel obligated to keep talking. Protecting your energy is a professional skill. There is a common belief that intelligent people should correct every mistake they encounter. In reality, intelligent people often become selective about where they invest their attention. Not every inaccurate statement deserves correction. Not every disagreement deserves discussion. Not every opinion deserves analysis. Sometimes the most productive response is, "Interesting," and then returning your attention to something more important. This is not avoidance. It is prioritization. People who maintain strong professional relationships understand that energy is a limited resource. Spending it on every irritating comment leaves less available for work that actually matters. Examples of professional responses when you're irritated: when they explain something you already know. Them, "You should probably save the file before closing it." You, "Good point. I've already done that." The response acknowledges the comment without rewarding it with an argument. When they offer unsolicited advice. Them, "You should do it this way." You, "Thanks. I've already got an approach I'm comfortable with." This communicates confidence without inviting a debate. When they speak with excessive certainty. Them, "Nobody thinks that way." You, "Some people probably do, some probably don't. I'd rather be considerate just in case." The focus remains on your values rather than proving them wrong. When you're running out of patience. Them, "You worry too much." You, "Possibly. I'd rather be slightly cautious than accidentally create problems for other people." The response remains professional, even if you are privately frustrated. When you need the conversation to end, you should listen to my advice. I appreciate the suggestion. I'll think about it. Most experienced professionals understand what that sentence means. I heard you. I am not arguing. I am also not following your advice. Sometimes that is all that needs to be said.
Frequently asked questions and myths. Myth: does silence mean approval?
No. Silence can mean politeness, caution, fatigue, or conflict avoidance. It does not always mean people agree. Why do some people have very little self-awareness? Often because they rarely receive honest feedback. Politeness can unintentionally protect inaccurate self-perceptions for years. Should I tell them what everyone says behind their back? Usually no. Repeating workplace gossip often creates more conflict than improvement. Why do their comments irritate me so much? Because repeated unsolicited advice can feel dismissive, patronizing, or disrespectful of your judgment. Is it my responsibility to fix them? No. Your responsibility is managing your own behavior. Their self-awareness belongs to them. Final thoughts. One of the more frustrating discoveries in adult life is realizing that not everyone sees themselves the way others do. Some people receive so little honest feedback that they genuinely believe their behavior is helpful when it is actually creating friction around them. That does not mean you need to challenge every irritating comment. In many cases, trying to prove someone wrong creates more frustration than progress. People rarely become more self-aware when they feel attacked. They are far more likely to reflect when they feel respected, which is why calm certainty is usually more effective than confrontation. It is also worth remembering that silence does not always mean approval. Many people avoid uncomfortable conversations, allowing inaccurate self-perceptions to survive for years. You cannot control another person's self-awareness. You can control how much energy you give to their behavior. The goal is not to win every conversation. The goal is to protect your peace, maintain your professionalism, and avoid letting someone else's lack of awareness become your loss of self-control. Related articles: how to respond when a question makes you feel defensive, how to warn someone their behavior is rude, and how to help people think constructively.